This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam. I'm your host, and I'm delighted to be joined once again by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Well, I'm glad that it's still a delight for you, Sam.
So far, it's these 200 plus podcasts, and it's still a delight. So
well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Along the way, you've taken your jabs, but
I've likewise.
Yeah, well, I try, but I try to let not let those get to me too much, and
that's part of being a son-in-law.
Well, it's
it just comes with the territory.
Yeah, likewise for being a father-in-law. So, but I think it's important, and we've actually even it's funny. We've had people even comment before, that you sort of take some pot shots at me, which is funny because it's, I don't think I've ever once lost sleep over any of your digs.
Because they're always true.
Well, because they don't matter. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter. But I think what other people maybe perceive as being rude or whatever. I know where it comes from, and I just it's never once bothered me, and I think that's not always the case though. Sometimes, people say things in jest or maybe carelessly, and sometimes those things sting, and if we're not careful, the words that people say to us can really leave some deep wounds.
Yeah, that's true, Sam. And I want to talk about that today. I've kind of sort of titled this maybe, a heart of a dove, the skin of a rhino. And we've touched on this before, but I think it's just such a common leadership issue of anytime you're in the trenches, anytime you're dealing with people, you're going to have your critics, you're going to have your opponents, people trying to undermine you. And if you don't guard your heart's going to become hardened and cynical and negative. Yeah. And at the same time, the way to guard your heart is to have a thick skin. And sometimes that's easier to say than to actually do, because we're human, and it matters to us when people say unkind things and attack us. And of course, yeah, as you say, it's funny because I think quite a ways back, we had someone comment that they thought, boy, Richard, you were really taking Sam to task. And like, I showed that to you, and we were both racking our brains like, when was that? Like, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
And it's like, what was just sort of repartee on our part. Someone was listening to and thought, whoa, Richard must have had a bad day. Or you must have been accidentally drunk decaf instead of the real thing. But and so, obviously you want to watch how you come across, but also I think it makes a difference. If someone else perhaps had said some of the same things, you might have been offended and thought, who are they to say that? But if you know the guy's heart, you know that he loves you, you know that they'd be mortified if they actually had hurt you in some way.
Yeah.
Then you accept those lines entirely differently. And so I want to talk just a little bit about that, because I love when I come across a leader who's been in the trenches for years and they still can tear up when they think about the people they work with. And you can tell that they really love what they do. They love the people they do it with. They love how they've been able to serve God. And they still have a tender heart after all these years, maybe of working in corporate America or working in the church. And yet, at the other hand, it's not like they haven't had their attacks, but they have developed that kind of thick skin that just bounces off. They just don't take it personally, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. And I've shared before an experience I had when I was the seminary president, and won't get into all the details, except that at a certain point, at a very big, important banquet that we would have each year, a prominent leader in our denomination got up and basically kind of slammed me, just said some things that were mostly just careless and unthought out, but they were quite insulting. And basically, in essence, he just said, after I had been there 5 years, that he couldn't think of a solitary good thing I'd done, which was ludicrous, because even where he was saying that in a brand new building that had been built since I'd been there. I mean, we just looked around and said, well, where we're sitting, this furniture, this facility didn't exist 5 years ago. But so, I mean, on its face, it was obvious that what he was saying couldn't possibly be true. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it was like, but after all I've done, how could you even joke about that? How could you even think that would be funny to try to insinuate that after 5 years of some of the hardest work and really the most fruitful work I'd ever done, that he is joking about the fact that no one could think of any contribution I made. And I just didn't have a thick enough skin that day. I think I was kind of tired, and I was perhaps in a little bit of a vulnerable spot at the time, but I didn't have the thick skin I should have had. And I remember going away and really being just taking it hard, and I knew I was taking it too hard, but I just didn't have the skin for it. And I remember not long after that, I had a very lucrative job inquiry. Someone that came wanting to hire me for a job that would have paid me a lot more money than I was making, and would have had a lot of perks to it. And I normally probably I wouldn't have been, I would have dismissed it, but my hurt feelings at the time caused me to want to, be interested. Yeah. And
tell me more.
It's like, and I ultimately did turn it down, but I did feel very. I mean, it was an attractive job, so I mean, I would have been interested just because it was a great opportunity, but it made me vulnerable, and in a sense that kind of scared me, because I thought, you know what, if I don't have a thick skin, then I might get vulnerable some other way. What if my wife says something that hurts my feelings, and I go to work and there's some flirtatious female there? Like, I better develop a thick skin so that whatever comes my way, I'm not bouncing back and reacting in some foolish, destructive way. I better just be able to take things in stride, because if I'm going to lead, it's inevitable that this is going to happen. So by the way, there's an interesting passage. I won't take time to read it all right now, but 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 5 to 12, Absalom has launched a civil war against David, and we talked a bit about that recently. But as David is having to flee the city with his handful of loyal soldiers and subjects, a man named Shimei, he is from King Saul's relatives, and of course resents David for kind of wiping out a bunch of his relatives and fighting. David never fought against King Saul, but he fought against Saul's son, and so Shimei just starts to insult him and say to him, look at you overthrew my, Saul and his family, and now look at your son is overthrowing you, and you deserve it, and you're a man of bloodshed, and so sure enough, bloodshed's come on your head, and he's throwing stones at David and his people, and David's got some mighty men with him. And Abishai, I always kind of like him. He's always kind of there at David's right hand, and we've talked about him before. But he turned to David and he says, "That's, dog, like, let me just take his head off and silence him." And David says something kind of interesting. He just says, "Just leave him alone. Maybe this may be from God." David knows he's being humbled. David knows that he's not done everything right. But then David says, "But if perhaps God will vindicate me." And now, of course, David's got when you got a bunch of mighty men, you can vindicate yourself. You can just say, "Go kill that guy." But even though David could have done that, when you're at your lowest point in your life, the last thing you want is someone laughing at you along the way, saying, "You deserve everything you get, and it couldn't happen to a better guy." And,
or poking at all your vulnerabilities already.
It's already painful enough, and then this guy's just jumping on. But David, in that moment, said, "No, I'm going to let God prove me right, and which is a hard thing because he could have proved his rightness on his own.
Yeah.
And so he just keeps on going. And so what you see with David, of course, David has a tender heart. You read some of his Psalms and his love for God and his desire to worship God with all of his heart. And you know that he's got a tender heart. He's a musician. He writes all these songs about his love for God. But he's also been a soldier, and he's faced all kinds of verbal assaults and physical assaults. And so, as I look at how David handled that, of course, what's going to happen is that David will ultimately win that war, will defeat his enemies. He will return as king once again. And David doesn't do anything to Shimei, even though he's been proven to be right. But as David is dying, he's going to say to Solomon, his son and successor, he's going to tell Solomon, hey, Shimei really did me wrong back then. Make sure you kind of take care of him. So I'm not quite sure what that says about David, but essentially Solomon says to Shimei, okay, just stay on your farm. As long as you stay on your farm, I'll let you live. You ever leave your farm, you ever go anywhere, and you're a dead man. And so one day he leaves his farm, and he ultimately finds out that Solomon was true to his word, and he dies at the hands of Solomon's henchmen. But so David, I looked at that and I thought, well, so how does he handle that? And he does a couple of things. One is one thing I would just say is don't be surprised when attacks come, verbal attacks, criticisms come. If you're leading, it's going to happen. If you do anything, there's going to be some naysayer, some armchair expert who's going to have had an opinion that they could do it. They would have done it entirely differently. And I've had to. You have to really guard your heart. But it's interesting to me sometimes because I've had people that I might be leading the entire organization, and here's somebody in a way down line who is certain that they know, even only having maybe 5% of the information that you had, but they're sure that you've done it wrong, and they would have done it entirely differently. And you think to yourself, if you were that brilliant of a leader, you probably wouldn't be in the job you're in now. But but why would you let some voice like that get under your skin? And why would you start to let them get in your head where it even mattered what they criticized you for, that you didn't just brush it off, just let it bounce off you? And so, that's one thing. It's just know it's going to happen. And, I think secondly, you need to certainly evaluate the source of the criticism, the attacks. I think maybe David, when this one of Saul's relatives is attacking him, I think David probably realizes, well, we did kill off a number of his relatives, and they all were thinking that they'd be the royal family for a long time, and they lasted just one generation. And so I get it that they're upset, and of course they're out of line the way they're talking to me, but I can, you're sort of evaluating the source, and you're saying, if I were them, maybe I'd be upset too, but I'll let it go. And that has often helped me when I begin to evaluate, where is this guy coming from, and why is he so upset? And he's certainly overstating the case, but I get it that he's upset or whatever. And a third thing is just remember that your leadership is not about you. It's not, you're being criticized, but don't ever let it become about you. Your job is to lead your organization to become all that God intends for it to be. It is not for you to be celebrated, for people to always think the best of you. And so if the attacks are just about you, then you realize, okay, well, but how's the organization doing? If the organization's doing well, if sales are up, if we're achieving our purpose, if we're advancing forward and meeting our goals, then does it really matter if I'm taking some on the chin? That is part of leading an organization. And so if it all becomes about you, though, and I've known people that literally the whole mission of the organization got hijacked as someone was trying to protect their own reputation. And and it begins to be all about the leader, not about the organization. And
Yeah.
so, I think you have to just be careful to say, listen, if it's harming somehow the organization, well, I may have to address this. But if it's just people attacking me, just taking pot shots, I've got to get a thick enough skin to realize, hey, that comes with the territory.
Yeah, well, let's take a quick break here and we'll wrap up in just a minute. Christ loves the church with an infinite, eternal love that is beyond our comprehension. Unfortunately, the church often doesn't function in a way that Christ intended. Many Christians fail to understand that God's ways are not their ways, and when we attempt to do God's work the world's way, the results are dissatisfying and even damaging. When a church seeks a new pastor, they stand at a crossroads. How that decision is handled will determine the church's future. Your Next Pastor is a guide that was written to help you seek your next pastor in ways that both protect the health of the church and give great hope and blessings for the future. Pick up your copy today at blackabystore.org. Links will be in the show notes. Well, nobody likes to be criticized, and it's always a hard thing. It seems like to listen to criticism of yourself, but as we've seen, it's best not to try and vindicate yourself. And I think something that really makes this stand out to me, at least, is when you see people who are sort of have pot shots taken at them online on social media.
Oh, yeah.
And the best thing to do is to ignore those. But if you don't ignore those, like, it just is infinitely worse when you try and wade in and say, well, yeah, but wait a second, that's not true. And let me just let that go. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves that not all criticism is the same, and to have that thick skin when it comes to criticism. So maybe as we wrap up, what are some other ways that we can develop that rhinoceros skin that you so mentioned in the beginning?
Yeah, I think, maybe a fourth thing is just to realize that God does allow humbling circumstances. There's so many things about being a leader that can foster our pride.
Yeah.
That I think it's almost like if all God gave us was a gas pedal, we'd be just going way too, out of control.
Yeah.
And so there's also those humbling situations that come along that are kind of like the brake. They just sort of keep our foot on reality a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, I think that we kind of need to remain humble. And so now and then those comments can just kind of keep our feet on the ground. Sometimes God uses our spouses to do that.
Yeah. I'd say oftentimes.
Yeah, it doesn't take much for my wife, and I know your wife. I raised her, so I know that she can make a comment that just takes that air out a little bit, which we need now and then. So, so sometimes I think God just lets that happen. If all we ever got was praise, if everybody just always just went on and on and on about how wonderful we were, we'd be very vulnerable. And so even if it's not justified, even if it's not true, I think sometimes those attacks are just you can maybe kind of value some of those. You want to be careful. I know people that feel like it's almost a badge of honor that they're always being attacked and criticized. It's like, I must be doing something right. All these people hate my guts, Or
you could be doing something wrong.
Yeah,
and that's why
so
everybody
I'm
hates
cautious about that. But but at the same time, you can embrace some of that and say, I know why a loving God might just allow some of this. It keeps me humble. And I've also found, just kind of like you alluded to with social media, it's bad enough when maybe someone attacks you, but it usually only makes it worse if you attack back. If you try to defend yourself, if you're being trolled on social media and you try to enter into a hearty debate, it's just
good luck.
Typically, I mean, there are some people now and then that will kind of be genuinely asking a question or wanting something clarified, and if I feel like that's more what it is, I might answer. But if it's just clearly a troll, if it's just clearly someone looking to somehow just engage someone in a conversation, debate, and it elevates them, that you even noticed them and cared about what they had to say.
Yeah, and I think there will always be more critics than there are creators, and I think not even just... And I guess you could say being creative is a form of leadership, but you're putting something out there that you have you've put your name on, whether that's leading an organization, creating work of art, whatever. And anytime you do that, there's just the ratio of critics to creators or critics to leaders is always going to be such that there's just, by definition, people are going to have something negative to say about it. And so just to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, and I found over the years people that really were critical of what I did. I'll tell you what, in large part, just kind of there were a number of times I really wanted to enter into a debate and set the record straight and point out some of their shortcomings, of which there were many. But it never edifies. It never really resolves the issue. And I just found that so much of the time, just better to let it go, especially if it's focused on you. And like I said, if it's harming the organization, that's one thing. If it's really just an attack on how you lead and your motives and so on, let it go. And I've just, as I've looked back, at times I've kind of, I don't do this often, but just start to reflect back on over the years, who are those voices that just really got under my skin, that said some things that were unkind. And, the vast percentage of the time, those folks, you don't even see them anymore. Like they're gone. Like they were just a fleeting kind of a voice, and they're not even in the job anymore. You don't even know where they are. They failed in their roles. They weren't successful themselves. Of course, if your greatest strength is your ability to criticize others, that's not really something to build a career on. And so, I look back and I think I couldn't even tell you where most of my critics of the past even are today. They're just gone. They're not there in the field anymore. So, why would I spend a bunch of energy on that if time will just kind of settle that anyway? And for all the things I was criticized for, God continues to bless. I'm just so grateful that God keeps on using me and my ministry, my leadership, and so that's all I need to worry about is, well, what does God want me to do, and not what does my critics say today? How do I need to respond to him today? So don't get derailed. I think that's just one of the worst things that can happen to people is when their critic hijacks their leadership role, their mission, and pulls them out of the saddle. And now instead of riding forward where God wanted them to go, they're in a mudslinging fight somewhere. And they have settled for much less for their leadership than they should have. And the last one is just we've kind of alluded to, but just trust in God's vindication. At the end of the day, if you really are in the right, God has a way over time of making that obvious, who was really in the right, who wasn't in the right, and let God do that. And so, certainly, I think if you can kind of develop some of those practices, your skin is certainly going to get thicker. And it's not going to affect you as much. And just for maybe in the closing moments, just realize too, though, that you want a thick skin, but you also want a tender heart. And one of the ways I think you get a tender heart is you keep your eyes on God, and you let Him take the blows instead of you. And there's a wonderful psalm that I think leaders need to read now and then, and especially if you're going through a hard time. And it's Psalm 31. And let me just read some of those verses for you. There's just times I think if you feel like you're being assailed, second guessed, what God says is sometimes don't just charge out there to fight all your critics, but come into God's fortress, come into God's refuge, and just let God kind of close the drawbridge and just abide in Him. Just find yourself in Christ and find your peace there. And it doesn't mean that the enemies aren't outside. They might still hate you and dislike you and disagree with you. But once you're in the fortress of God, then He takes the blows, and now that's His problem, and you just rest in God. And I think maybe there's some listeners who probably just need to hear that today. I know you're stressed, I know you're anxious, and to rest in God. And so Psalm 31 says, Lord, I seek refuge in you. And notice it doesn't say from you. Don't give me refuge, God, but be my refuge. God is your fortress. He is your refuge. Let me never be disgraced. Save me by your righteousness. Listen closely to me. Rescue me quickly. Be a rock of refuge for me, a mountain fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. You lead and guide me for your name's sake. You will free me from the net that is secretly set for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hand I entrust my spirit. Now you recognize that phrase.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting about the last thing Jesus said? Was quoting from this psalm. And he said, you have redeemed me, O Lord, God of truth. I hate those who are devoted to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad. Obviously that's a choice he makes.
Yeah.
I'll be glad in your faithful love, because you have seen my affliction. You know the troubles of my soul, and have not handed me over to the enemy. You set my feet in a spacious place. And so he's saying, God, I know that you know what's going on in my life. You see the attacks. And I can trust you with that. I trust that you'll take care of it. And you've taken me and put me in a safe place, a good place. Be gracious to me, Lord, because I'm in distress. My eyes are worn out from frustration, my whole being as well. Indeed, my life is consumed with grief, and my years with groaning. My strength has failed. Verse 11 says, I am ridiculed by all my adversaries, and even by my neighbors. I am dreaded by my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street run from me. I'm forgotten, gone from memory, like a dead person, like broken pottery. I've heard the gossip of many. Terror is on every side. When they conspired against me, they plotted to take my life. It sounds pretty troubling at this point.
It's a pretty dark place.
But he says, but I trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. The course of my life is in your power. Rescue me from the power of my enemies and from my persecutors. Make your face shine on your servant. And that's, of course, in the Old Testament especially. If God chooses to shine his face upon you, that means he's smiling upon you. He's pleased with you. And as long as God is pleased with you, it matters not what others think of you. Save me by your faithful love. Lord, do not let me be disgraced when I call on you. Let the wicked be disgraced. Let them be quiet in Sheol. Okay, he's getting a little harsh there, but what he's doing is he's saying, God, I'm leaving their punishment and my vindication with you. Let lying lips that arrogantly speak against the righteous in proud contempt be silenced. How great is your goodness that you have stored up for those who fear you, and accomplished in the sight of everyone for those who take refuge in you. You hide them in the protection of your presence. You conceal them in a shelter from human schemes, from quarrelsome tongues. Blessed be the Lord, for he has wondrously shown his faithful love to me in a city under siege. And some of you are going to feel like you are under siege right now. In my alarm, I said, I am cut off from your sight. But you heard the sound of my pleading when I cried to you for help. Love the Lord, all his faithful ones. The Lord protects the loyal, but fully repays the arrogant. Be strong and let your heart be courageous, all you who put your hope in the Lord. There are just times where you just need some of those psalms to just say, Lord, that's what I need. I need a refuge right now, and I'm just not going to wear myself out just trying to constantly fight against everybody who's got something negative, critical to say about me. And, if you'll do that, if you'll keep your heart upon God, then you can protect your heart from growing cynical and negative, critical. Your skin needs to be thick, but your heart needs to be soft. Mm-hmm. And so find a way. Don't get it reversed, where your heart is hard and your skin is soft.
Make sure that's the default, I think, for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
That's the tendency.
Yeah. So keep a thick skin, a soft heart. If you can do that over the years as a leader, you'll find that you'll have many wonderful relationships that you'll develop, many people you'll love and that will love you. But your thick skin will have just kind of not been victimized by the inevitable comments and criticisms and attacks that come when someone tries to lead.
All right. Well, thank you for walking us through this, Richard. Thanks for taking the time and just this another great reminder for all those who lead.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackv.org.